Hi there, my name is Jennifer Adams, and I'm the editor-in-chief with the Knowledge Hook Signature Leadership Series, and thrilled to be here with you today. Thank you for joining us on this first week in July. Our topic today is SEL and International Relations, and it is such an interesting topic. And of course, it's part of our SEL Global Leadership Series, which is sponsored by 3 organizations. Karanga is our first one, and Karanga is an organization, a not-for-profit that began in 2019, and it is the Global Alliance for SEL and Life Skills. And that group, which I'm a proud member of, and as are the other panelists today, works on advocacy, connected communities, implementation support, and cutting edge research. And the link is there, and we invite you to join us at any time on that site. Our second partner is Salzburg Global Seminar, and Salzburg Global Seminar is an organization that came to being slightly after the First World War or Second World War. And it was really the idea of bringing people together to create better and future leaders. And certainly at that time, there was an obvious need for strong leadership to create a better world. And sadly, in some ways, there's still that need. And so we're thankful that Salzburg Global Seminar exists. And again, you're welcome to access that through their link. And finally, the third partner is Knowledge Hook. And Knowledge Hook is a Canadian digital math company. And they support teachers and students in formative assessment and professional learning. And as part of that, they have created a thought leadership series. And that thought leadership series, this webinar, this roundtable is part of that. And you're welcome to create an account. We've got all sorts of things there that can help you if you're a teacher in a classroom or someone at a university level or district or ministry leadership. So you're welcome to access all of those free resources. So who's with us today? We have, for registrants, we have registrants from 6 Canadian provinces and territories. We have registrants from 20 US states and from 20 countries. And it's really fun to see that people are interested in that connection between SEL and international relations. And I am going to pass it on to my very wonderful friend, Dominic Regester. He is going to be our host. Dominic is Interim Program Lead with Salzburg Global Seminar. He is one of the executive committee members for Karanga, and he will introduce to us Anna and Mark. Dominic, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jen. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. As those of you who've participated before will know, all of the roundtables in this series have been about the intersection of social emotional learning and other topics. On many occasions, we focused on the role of SEL in education reform, and we've also occasionally looked at the application of social and emotional learning outside of school. So there was a brilliant discussion almost a year ago, I think, about SEL in the workplace. And today, we're really excited to be focusing on social emotional learning and international relations. All of the partners involved in organizing these webinars, so Salzburg Global Seminar, where I work, Karanga and Knowledge Hook, believe very strongly that social and emotional learning needs to be a core component of the response to multiple challenges that countries, societies, economies, and communities around the world are grappling with and will need to resolve if we're to thrive and prosper as a species in this century. So to be clear, when we're talking about social and emotional learning skills and behaviors and competencies, we're talking about things like communication, empathy, emotional regulation, self-awareness, respect for others, and many more besides. So as I said, today we're going to look at social emotional learning and international relations. And we want to take a deliberately broad definition of international relations. So we're talking about contact, communication, relations between people from different countries, so at the level of the individual, but then also at the level of businesses working internationally, between NGOs or other public sector international engagements, and then also at the level of state engagement and relations between countries. A really interesting illustration, I think, of the importance of what we want to talk about came from the Brookings Institute, the think tank based in New York back in 2014 or 2015. So in the run-up to the announcement and finalization of the Sustainable Development Goals, Brookings published a brilliant piece of analysis looking at the kinds of skills and behaviors that populations would need to have in greater abundance in order to meet the challenges that the Sustainable Development Goals were designed to address. And social emotional learning skills and behaviors and competencies were really prominent in this analysis. I think it's fair to say that all of us involved in this webinar, and hopefully all of you joining, believe that social emotional learning skills that can be learned in school are critical to future international relations. And everyone who teaches, and we have many classroom practitioners and teachers joining us today, is potentially teaching a future head of state or a future diplomat or someone who will be working and engaging internationally. So the structure for our webinar today is we'll have roughly 25 minutes of conversation with Mark and Anna, and then we'll have about 25 minutes for Q&A. And our semi-structured part of the conversation is going to follow roughly three themes. We're going to talk about the need for social and emotional learning in international relations. We're going to talk a bit about the skills and opportunities that exist in school to develop them. And then we're going to talk about the impact of the pandemic on this. And if appropriate, we'll bring in questions that come from everyone listening as the conversation evolves. And then, as I said, we'll have bespoke time, dedicated time at the end to address questions. So please feel free to put as many questions as you want in the chat. Also, feel free to engage with one another. When you are replying or posting questions, make sure that you've set it so that it is for all panelists and attendees, so that everybody can see your question. And yeah, as I said, feel free to engage with one another. One of the mantras that we use to govern an awful lot of the work that we do at Salzburg Global is to be tough on the issues and kind on each other, kind to each other. So please keep that in mind if you vehemently disagree with something that someone else has posted. Before I introduce the speakers, we would like to start with two questions for you, the audience, that we would love to get your thoughts on. So I'm just putting these in the chat now. So the first is, how do you think social and emotional learning can or should contribute to international relations? And the second is, to what extent can social and emotional learning help make the world a safer and more prosperous place? So please feel free to post responses and thoughts and reflections to those two questions, and that will give some really interesting ideas for our two expert speakers to respond to. So we have two brilliant speakers today. I'm in an unusual position of I've worked for both of them at different points in the last few years. So it's a great pleasure to be inviting them onto this, and they're both very involved with Karanga and part of the steering committee for Karanga. So Anna Rold is the founder and CEO of Diplomatic Courier, which is an amazing media organization based in Washington but working globally. And Mark Herbert is Director of Schools and Skills at the British Council, which is the UK's cultural relations organization. So by way of introduction, I would love to ask Anna first and then Mark why this topic is important for you. So Anna, over to you first.
Thank you so much, Dominic and Jennifer. It's great to be with you today. It's great to be with you, Mark, as well, and everyone that has joined us. This is a bit of a soft spot for me. I really enjoy speaking about this because I originally come from the world of international relations, where everything was about hard power and negotiations. And so I was formally trained to be a zero-sum game type of a negotiator. And then I went into the world of media and publishing and education, and something clicked differently about the skills I learned and the skills of the future, which are the types of skills that everyone in our audience is teaching right now. So the world I came from was the world of the zero-sum game, diplomacy. And that was the sort of world of international relations as we knew it in the past, where every solution was a top-down approach. The Millennium Development Goals, I know, Dominic, you spoke about the Sustainable Development Goals, which are they followed the Millennium Development Goals that the UN Secretary General at the time, Kofi Annan, put forth. The MDGs at the time were the job of heads of states and countries to solve for, eradication of poverty, universal education, healthcare for all. Those were the types of goals that countries and governments and heads of states were in charge of. But then the Sustainable Development Goals ushered this new era where solution making was the business of everybody. And so for the first time, you saw this change, this paradigm shift that we're living in right now, where collaboration among different actors became sort of the name of the game. And it wasn't so much, the onus was not anymore on heads of states and governments to bring up these solutions, but it was on everybody. And when I say everybody, a new constituency that came in to solve issues that was very, very enthusiastic was youth, students all around the world. And it was very interesting to look at how hungry they were to make solutions. And so when we talk about SEL, which, you know, we talk about skills that are in sort of the neighborhood of collaboration and solution making and being self-aware, those are the kinds of things that young people right now are learning so that they can be better solution makers or offer better solutions for some of the most intractable issues of our time, of our century. And there are many, and they transcend borders. And so we're in a very exciting sort of new era where we see that finally changing, where we might see solutions we haven't seen before because we have a broader group of actors acting and solving together. So I wanted to bring that on as first part of the conversation because I think it's very important. The second part that is very important to me is to mention, also coming from the world of top-down approach, you know, the ivory towel solution makers, is that things have changed. The problems that we're dealing with right now, post-World War II, are more in the Commonwealth arena, meaning problems like climate change, clean air, issues like, resource conflicts and things like that. Those are problems that transcend borders. The year we just all experienced with the pandemic was a very good illustration of what happens when we are not employing SEL skills to solve issues, where we're not employing SEL skills to come up with solutions that affect everyone, no matter what. And so what we're seeing right now is a very interesting, shift in how we do things in international relations, where countries are seeing that just vaccinating your own population, just being more nationalistic is not enough to solve issues that are going to eventually affect how your own population is going to deal with these problems. So globalization, which tends to have a negative connotation, especially in North America with certain constituencies, now becomes the solution, the problem and the solution to these issues. And so from that approach, international relations in general is shifting because SEL is becoming more mainstream. And because SEL is becoming more mainstream, that is helping us solve these mega issues in a different way, where we have more hope that these issues can be tackled in our generation. And again, I can't stress enough how important it is that the future of education and work is happening right now. And the catalysts for that future are the very people who are attending this session, who are the ones teaching this generation the incredible skills needed to solve for some of these intractable problems of our time. And again, I apologize for the very long sort of introduction, but I thought it was important to kind of bring the big picture of the paradigm shift that we're experiencing.
Anna, that was fantastic. Thank you. There's a conference worth of ideas there and lots that we can come back to. But Mark, I'd love to bring you in and just with that same opening question, why does this topic resonate with you, or why is it important for you?
Thanks. And like Anna, I'm delighted to be here. It's great to be in the event and to be able to speak both to the group, but also to hear from the group. And I can see the chat's already filling up with comments and questions, which I'd love to respond to, but I'll answer your question, Dominic. So at a most basic level, I'm a parent to a 12-year-old, a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old. And as Anna indicated, they are going out into the world and are going to be the future of the connections, not only here in our country, and I'm in the UK near London, but across every country. They're going to be involved in business one way or another. Globalization, the good and the bad of it, will be what they live with. They will be part of that. So as a parent, I'm really keen that the education they receive prepares them well for that changing world. And that means not just learning the knowledge that, the basic knowledge that they require through school, the mathematics, etc., which, they need, there's no doubt about that, but also the full breadth of social and emotional skills that will help them not only in their own family, community, their own life, the resilience that they need to get through the bumps in the road of life, but also to engage internationally. And then turning to international relations, if we think about that, and I work for the British Council, an organisation was also formed just around the Second World War, at a time when Europe and most of the world was in real chaos. And the objective of the organisation was, and still is, to build a friendly knowledge and understanding between the UK and other countries through education and through culture. So that objective of the whole organisation connects very closely to the importance of SEL skills at a personal level. So Anna, I agree with a lot of what you said, and I would reinforce it. I won't go over that because we perhaps can begin to come through that in the conversation, in the discussion later. But maybe just to say a little bit more about the British Council and why, in my role, I'm directly interested in this topic. As I said, the British Council's role is to build trust and understanding between the UK and other countries. But at its heart, that means people. That means people connecting, young people in the UK, learning through overseas visits to universities, to schools, what it is to be living in another culture, what it is to speak another language, what it is to connect with people who are different from you. So the other, but all the time making the other a little bit less different. There's far more that connects us and binds us. The similarities are far greater than the differences. Yet the risks, the SDGs essentially are a set of objectives to overcome the risks the world is facing. But the risks of not being able to connect internationally, for young people not to be able to engage with young people around the world, who are going to grow up to be the adults around the world, the decision makers around the world. If they cannot do that effectively, the risk is that those SDGs won't, the risks underpinning them will materialize. So as Anna said, the challenges that are global, that transcend boundaries, like climate change, but also really practical things like water, availability of water. If you live on the Nile, you are really dependent on what happens upstream in another nation. So these are practical things that need to be worked out between nations and between individuals. The social and emotional learning that enables young people and future adults to engage and resolve those global challenges are underpinned by the social and emotional skills they gain through their education right now. So the British Council is involved in that work, and I'll talk a bit more about bits and pieces of that later on. But at its heart, there's an inextricable link between SEL and the learning now for our young people and the solution to the intractable global problems that we all face, which is essentially what international relations is about.
Brilliant, thank you. I mean, you both have extensive experience working internationally, and you've both made kind of interconnected, compelling cases for why this is an important topic. But I wondered if you had specific examples of where you've seen the application of social and emotional learning skills to address an international problem, or to add value, or look for a new solution. So Anna, would you like to tackle that first, or Mark, you're very welcome to.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I will wear my professor hat for a moment and talk about, while I was teaching at Northeastern University early on in my career, it was post 9/11 in America. And so, emotions ran very high. And at the time, this discussion about the clash of civilizations was kind of front and center in our media and our thought leadership. This idea that ultimately the Muslim world and the Western world were going to clash, and of course, a lot of self-fulfilling prophecy happened right around the post 9/11 era. And so we started this program at Northeastern University at the time called the Dialogue of Civilizations. And it was supposed to rebut the idea that there is a clash. And the idea behind it was that if you bring people together through cultural exchanges, language learning, basically help foster SEL skills, that it would create ultimately an environment where this clash wouldn't happen. It was also a secondary goal with that program. And the secondary goal was that the nature of education, this was back in 2006 and 2007, the nature of learning itself is changing dramatically. We are all now learners, whether we are in university, whether we're young kids, whether we are 66 and we're retired. We've entered already a lifelong learning sort of paradigm. And so the reason Dialogue of Civilizations was also built for the non-traditional student, the student at the university who wasn't coming as a freshman, a 19-year-old or 18-year-old who was learning for the first time, how to be at a university campus, but also the military cadet who had retired from his service or her service, or a mom who took time off and came back, or someone who worked, during the day and could only take classes at night. The non-traditional student was also the lifelong learner. And so what we learned with these programs was that the level of understanding that people at all stages were able, all stages of learning were able to acquire was absolutely phenomenal. And I'm not going to go into very specific examples, but we had students in our delegations that would go to Egypt that had preconceived notions about the Arab League and the world in the Middle East, and only knew of Egypt as, as a place where you go see the pyramids. And they learned so much more about sort of the cultural underpinnings of, the political life and everything. And we had other students that would go to Bosnia-Herzegovina and feel the same way, that they were able to understand so much more. But we also had language immersion programs too. And that's something that Mark and I have also discussed a bit at length, where being able to communicate to others in their mother tongue is such a powerful thing. Being able to think in another language, as someone who's a polyglot myself, being able to think and speak with others in their native language, these are things that I couldn't even translate in English, that I was able to create so much more in-depth relationships, so much more meaningful relationships. And you can see how someone comes out with those kinds of experiences later on in life, not just as a student, but as a citizen of the world, being able to have that kind of understanding, collaboration, all very critical, not just appreciating other cultures, but also understanding the nuances of how other cultures come to make certain decisions, political or not. And again, a quick example would be the US State Department has all these international leadership visitor programs. A lot of the leaders of other countries go through these programs and have such an amazing understanding of our culture here in the US. Imagine if we can also reverse those things, and future American presidents or American legislators are able to do these kinds of exchange and able to understand more about the countries that their policy affects. So anyways, a couple of more concrete examples.
There's loads from what I know of Mark's work and the work of the British Council to respond to there, and a lot of the British Council's programs speak to that same agenda. But Mark, are there specific examples you'd like to highlight?
I'll pick a couple of really brief ones, because it'd be good to begin to respond to some of the other questions. One is one that's actually live at the moment. So right now, about 1,500 young people from across England are engaged in a program called the Mandarin Excellence Program. It's funded by the Department for Education in England, and the British Council, along with the University College London, is administering the scheme. And 50 plus schools across England are involved in this. What they're doing is studying Mandarin. They're studying Mandarin, but as part of their studies, they spend 2 weeks in an intensive program engaging with the reality of life in China. Now, pre-COVID, they were getting on planes. They were getting on planes and spending time walking the streets, going to the market, visiting the zoo. They were seeing the sights. They were also talking to regular Chinese people and having an opportunity to make the other less other, but also put their practical language skills to the test and deepening that, but bringing together cultural learning with language learning. Now, COVID has meant that we can't do that right now, but it's happening virtually over the next 2 weeks. And still, the kids are getting to go into the zoo and going to see the sights, but also walking through the market and with LiveLink, just experiencing life in China. Now, digital isn't the same as being there, and I'm a complete fan of the mobility programs that enable young people or older people to go and spend time in another country and culture, because you're not only gaining cultural understanding, you're also deepening the social and emotional skills that you learn naturally, but there's a systematic approach to learning those skills. The resilience, the confidence that comes with overcoming challenges, overcoming language barriers, discovering something about another culture. So it's just a live example right now. Those children are experiencing China. But if you step back and think of international relations, the relationship between Western nations as a whole, perhaps, and China is one of the most critical in terms of the economics, but also the trade and also the potential security consequences of a deteriorating relationship between Western nations and China. So this is a small glimmer of hope, small numbers of people perhaps, but nevertheless, it's a way of building a positive mutual link between the UK and China in this case, and also benefiting the participants. As you said, Dominic, the stacks of schemes, and Anna, you referred to some of the schemes that operate that enable young people to gain those skills, whether they're coming into our countries and spending time with us and learning about our country and culture, but equally in the other direction. And I would say that in the UK, we get a lot of visitors, which is fantastic, but traditionally students and young people from the UK are a little bit more reluctant to go abroad, partly because we have the benefit, but disadvantage of speaking English as a first language. So language study of French, German, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic is not as sort of intense, perhaps, because there is not quite the incentive to learn other languages when you can normally find somebody who can speak English. But to really connect with another country and culture, the ability to speak another language is critically important. Anyway, again, that's something we could perhaps come back to. Dominic, back to you.
So lots of the kind of international experience type programs have been around for much longer than social emotional learning has existed as a discipline, and it's still a relatively young discipline or field of inquiry in education. And international relations have obviously existed for much longer. So, why do you feel that there is a particularly acute need for an acceleration of SEL development for young people who'll be working internationally in the future? And how is that changing now? Because SEL didn't exist, at the turn of the 19th, 20th century in the same form that it does at the moment, but international relations did and alliances between countries did.
Dominic, shall I respond to that in the first?
Please.
I would disagree with you for a start. I think SEL exists, not in a framework set out by CASEL or OECD or anyone else in the kind of the formal framework of competencies as we know them as people involved in education. But nevertheless, the principles underpinning them, I think, have always been there. We've just perhaps codified them a little bit more. I do think there are some changes, though. The world where diplomats were the main interlocutors between one country and another, and they represented their whole country. They went on behalf of a government and negotiated a deal on something or other, averted maybe a conflict or even pushed for a conflict, who knows. Those days are gone. I mean, the diplomats are still here and they are essential for us. And so are the multilateral bodies that enable countries to interact as formal states. But we're all citizen diplomats in a way, or potentially citizen diplomats, through our use of social media, through our ability to choose to engage with others in other countries. Technology, one of the real challenges of COVID has been the need to pivot at speed to online learning in schools around the world. But I think it has also showed us that where there is the access to technology, I think there's another question about those who don't have access to technology. But for those who do have access to technology, it's proven that we can interact and work pretty effectively, not perfectly, but pretty effectively online in ways that, if we'd said to education systems 18 months ago, by the way, you're going to be teaching all your lessons online, you won't have any children in school, you wouldn't believe it, but more or less we've done it. There have been lots of downsides, but nevertheless, if we look on the bright side and a bit glass half full, I think that means that you recognize that our young people can connect with their peers around the world, and that helps to, in positive ways, understand others. But also it's to lobby, go back to those Sustainable Development Goals. If they're the code that sets out the big challenges in the world, climate change action will come from individuals as well as treaties and agreements between member states, through COP and so on. It's through individual actions and real concerted campaigns that change social and personal behavior. So I'm really hopeful that social emotional learning skills, digital literacy, the willingness and ability to engage with others, but also to understand global issues, the self-awareness, the self-regulation, etc., that's all related to that, and learned skills will help us deal with the global issues that decades ago were only dealt with by the diplomats. So I think we're all diplomats now.
Anna, you were nodding throughout that.
Oh, I mean, I couldn't agree more. We're all diplomats now. And in fact, and there's, what Mark is saying, sort of this new, not so new actually, it's been around for 20 years now, movement towards public diplomacy is everyone's diplomacy. There's a democratization because digitalization kind of democratized everyone's access to publics, to global publics. It changed the name of the game. I couldn't agree more with Mark on every single point. That's why I kept nodding on everything. And I would add to this a new dimension. We used to think in the international affairs, political science, ivory tower world, the students of international affairs and diplomacy, we used to think we were so special because we were learning these skills that, where they were talents and they were all coming out and being harnessed to do really cool things in the world. And all they were really, and we just identified them a little bit differently in the higher ed arena, is self skills. That's what we were teaching people. And some of us had, some of these talents that we needed to work on and sort of work and develop more, and others didn't, and so they had to learn from scratch. But I think the key here is that we can't leave it up to, I think SEL is important across the board from like 5 all the way to like 95, but we can't leave it up to the higher education system at that stage to introduce SEL skills into the world, especially because, as Mark said, with this democratization of diplomacy, right, comes a big challenge and opportunity. Now it's in the hands of somebody with a big following on Twitter to really mess things up if they wanted to in terms of international, state-to-state relations. And we've seen it happen. We've seen things happen, in a viral manner. So so it is important that these skills are not developed just for diplomats at a later stage in a higher ed environment, but they're developed as early as possible. And this is where I'll go back in. I'm involved in so many future of, conferences and discussions, and we talk about future of education as if it's something that's going to happen far away 20 years from now. But the future of education and work is happening right now. And it's in the hands, the biggest actors, in my opinion, right now, who are enabling that future are the very teachers who are creating the curricula in K-12 environments, not in college, which is also very important, although that's about to radically change. College as we know it in the next 10, 15 years will go under massive transformation. So we go back to, you learn these skills early, you learn how to be empathetic and wanting to learn foreign languages and wanting to experience cultures and collaborative and all of those things, all of those skills that SEL really pushes forward at a very, very early age. And they become part of the things that we take for granted. We now say, as part of our sustainable development goals, that numeracy and literacy, a certain level of numeracy and literacy has to be achieved in order for us to achieve this goal universally. And I would add to numeracy and literacy also SEL skills. It's that important. If you are, we've entered an era of where machines can handle machines, and the automation of automation is going to happen. So if we're teaching kids at an early stage and forward how to program really well, but we haven't taught them any of the other important things, like how to create, how to do this with values and ethics and understanding, then what we're doing is we're really creating more fancy machines. And I think this is sort of like, at the end of the day, what's really important about SEL.
So you've both talked about the pandemic and the impact that has had on, the capacity to put these skills into practice. I wondered if, there were examples of effective workarounds that you'd seen, or where people had been overcoming barriers, either around virtual exchange or, other initiatives that still create the space for young people to experience, Mark, as you put it, people from other countries, or experience the other at a time when it's much more complex to travel there. Maybe Mark, come to you because it relates to some of the council's programming, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, I touched on that Mandarin Excellence program, the ability of kids to connect and learn about Chinese culture from the UK. We've seen that in other programs as well, where we have a Connecting Classrooms program, where also the British Council runs the UK's Turing program, which is, for those of you who've heard of Erasmus Plus, now we're out of the EU as a member state. We're not part of the Erasmus Plus scheme. We have Turing, which has some similarities. We've seen less mobility because of COVID, but more digital connection. And as I said before, I think the jury's out. We really need to understand what the advantages and disadvantages of digital engagement are. I mean, on the plus side, there's lower cost. If you've got decent internet connection and any basic device, you can connect with countries and cultures and talk to other children and work on joint projects that may help deepen SEL skills, but also take action on global issues, whether it's environmental ones or social ones. So there's again, it's coming back to democratization, I suppose, the opportunity that the connections and skills learned through the COVID crisis now could be projected forward, and more of that online connection can take place. We'll have to wait and see whether increasing the volume of those connections and more opportunities for more young people and teachers to have those connections is actually better than the fewer face-to-face connections that existed through more expensive mobility programs. So I think they're both needed. I think that we will all learn a lot, and I'm sure educators on the call now have learned a lot from the experience of COVID. Some of it has been really tough experience, but nevertheless, we've learned from it, and we can project that forward and build better international links from that experience. There's still a place for face-to-face, though. I think there's something uniquely human about connecting with someone from another country and culture, learning about their thoughts, their perspectives, ideally in their language rather than your own home language, that builds a deeper relationship, and that sticks in your mind. It lives with you. If you spend some time overseas, that is a lifetime experience, will influence your thinking and your approach to global issues for your lifetime. I wonder whether a brief connection online will quite do the same, but we must all learn more about how that has gone.
It's also it's interesting about the frequency with which you can create the opportunity for online engagement, and that sort of little and often approach rather than the deep immersive experience. Anna and I wrote something at the beginning of the year about online networks and the capacity that that they offer to create new kinds of relationship amongst people who've never met in person, but are motivated by the same issues or challenges. I'd love to bring.
Could I be really rude? Just chip in on the chat. I think a point we haven't made, and has been made there in the chat, about international relations is really important as well. And I just wanted to mention that in the chat. Critically important.
So, I mean, I was going to turn to some of the questions that have been coming in on the chat anyway, and invite more of them. But Mark, is there something you'd specifically like to say about the international dynamic?
I suppose there's an assumption behind some of what I've been saying, which is you have a relatively homogeneous population in one country and a different culture in another. And we know the world isn't like that. No, we live to a greater or lesser extent, in multicultural communities. The UK is particularly multicultural, although Canada is too. But within that, we all have different histories and legacies of relationships between different communities. And the principles that we're talking about here about engaging internationally under international relations actually apply just as much domestically amongst different cultures and communities. So I suppose I'm just noting that it's important rather than saying anything different about it. We just need to not only think about the international. Particularly
at a time when so many countries are more divided domestically than they have been at other points in the recent past, at least it feels very much like that. I think the point that you were both making in different ways about the importance of the democratization of social and emotional learning, and the earlier it can be introduced into education practice, the more downstream value there'll be for populations is incredibly important. I read something the other day about Brexit analysis in the UK, and the single greatest predictor of whether you voted Remain or Leave in the Brexit referendum was whether you'd been to university or not. And it transcended whether you lived in an urban or a rural setting, the nature of the work that you did, gender, whether you voted for Labour or Conservative or Lib Dem governments, but that was the single greatest predictor. So the more exposure to these kinds of skills and practices and mental models, which is one of the things that social and emotional learning really offers, people can have, the better that process of building connection will be. I'd love to bring in a point that came from Sharik in the chat, if that's okay, which is about the terminology and the language, really, and that social and emotional learning is still quite a very Western discourse. It's a phrase or a concept that doesn't translate readily into many other languages. Life skills is often used as a very effective alternate. Sharik's point was that in order to create the sense of international social and emotional learning infused with diplomacy, we'll need first to be respectful of each country's approach to the various competencies that are considered important. And I wondered, Anna, in the work that you've done and all of the international contacts that you've had, where you've seen examples of that, and how do you manage difference in a way which is social and emotionally literate, for want of a better phrase?
It's a very, very good point, and a bit controversial, what I'm about to say. And it comes from a perspective, again, in our international relations paradigm, that the sovereignty first approach, right? What happens in your country is very important. And so all the solutions, all the discussions come from that first, that you have sovereignty and that a distinct understanding of solutions and the way you do things And so from that perspective, the UN and other multilateral institutions have been at a gridlock to change things, because if you're a member state of a country and you go into a discussion about solution making with the approach of this are the interests of my country or my nation, then you're not going to have a collaborative understanding of a solution and a problem. So all that to say that shifting from that approach of sovereignty first approach, finding a way to agree on some basic elements, the way we've agreed what basic human rights are. In education, we haven't done that. In fact, this has come up as a discussion before. We've agreed on basic numeracy and literacy and what that should look like around the world, but we haven't agreed on anything else. So perhaps, and again, it's because it's coming from that sovereignty first approach. There are considerations. Every country doesn't think about things the same way. And so to come to that agreement, we have to figure out a way that SEL skills, can be looked at from that same human rights, basic numeracy, literacy type of approach. And one way that I would suggest, from my point of view, is to say human skills. I think we all agree, we made a shift in the skills arena when we talked about future work and started talking, instead of talking about STEM and this and that, we started talking about human capital, putting the focus on the person as opposed to all of these other different things. And so that's one way of seeing it. But I think fundamentally, we need to also shift our mindset from a sovereignty, here is my interest approach, which, by the way, still is that zero-sum approach that diplomats and heads of states and ministers use at the very highest level, right? But you're not going to get a lot of solutions out of that approach, because that approach means if we enter a negotiation or if we enter a discussion to solve something big or small, if you take this slice of the pie, then I get a smaller pie. So the idea here is to figure out how to make the pie bigger so everyone gets a little more out of it. And there are now, formal ways of teaching negotiations and diplomacy with that approach, that everyone can win if we look at this from a collaborative approach. And I don't mean to get very theoretical about this, of course, but I'm very cognizant about how much in a gridlock the UN system and the international community at the G7, G20, IMF level, when they meet, how much they can't get stuff done because they're stuck on that approach. It's sovereignty first approach. And I think we need to be very sensitive of how countries view different terminologies and be cognizant and work out a way to have a general terminology that works the way the Human Rights Declaration works for everyone now, but we also have to be a bit more open-minded about it as well.
It was we had two brilliant guests on one of these roundtables a couple of months ago, Tony Jackson from the Asia Society and Leonor Strepich from Montessori Group. And Tony was talking, I think, about something that would resonate very strongly with what you've just said, Anna, about one of the big challenges in terms of education reform and also in wider society is that so many people leave education with what Tony described as a hegemonic mindset. So they see life as a zero-sum thing in which there need to be winners and losers. And one of the kind of great progressive education reform challenges, and SEL is, I think, a key component of this, is how do you help people leave education or leave formal schooling with more of an egalitarian mindset, that there can be win-wins. It doesn't have to be, for me to win and you to lose, or vice versa. I think it relates closely to something that Glenna Tabor has made in the chat as well about, with primary school students, they put a lot of emphasis on understanding others rather than agreeing with others, which I think is also part of the Montessori approach too. We've got time for a couple more questions. The hour has just flown by, so we've got probably 5 more minutes, and then we'll hand back to Jen for a wrap up. So I wondered if there were any final points that either of you would like to make, and if anyone watching would like to come in with a final question or two. We certainly have time to address that. So I think, we're seeing, some of what Anna, you were saying about, we need to help young people become better solution makers, and that young people are, have much more voice and opportunity to shape global solutions. That feels like a good advocacy argument for SEL and international relations. We're seeing, the way in which different social media platforms amplify voice in really interesting ways. And, Greta Thunberg is an amazing case study, in the application and utilization of some of those platforms. So do you think, where would you identify key opportunities for joint advocacy between people who are interested in social and emotional learning as an education reform topic, and then people who are already working at the level of international relations? Could you see an alliance forming between universities that prepare diplomats or foreign ministry international training programs and school reform initiatives? And have either of you come across anything like that so far?
So it's a very good question. And I wonder if it differs from country to country. So I'm assuming that certain countries or certain education systems have more, the teacher has more leeway in how they create curricula. The interesting part of all of this digitalization and democratization that has happened in the past decade is that there are more resources now available to teachers in the K-12 arena to use that would ultimately be only available to like a Harvard or an MIT. And now you see those resources being free and available to a much wider consortium. So it's only a matter of knowing where those resources are, figuring out if they would be appropriate for you to use in your curriculum. When Mark was talking earlier, one of the things I started thinking about is that, my goodness, there's so much availability of resources and SEL skills development if you're in the higher education arena, but where it really matters right now, we don't have it at the same level. Even the programs that we have described so far, they're available to college students or to students with degrees or later on in life. There's not a lot of cultural exchange happening. So I will tell you a bit of an anecdote of my own personal experience. I was in love with traveling, but I couldn't do any of it as a young kid who was, a migrant from Eastern Europe to Southeastern Europe, and then again to the United States. And so, but I was hungry to learn about other cultures and to learn foreign languages. And back in the day, the way you would do it is through pen pals. And I joined this program in Europe, and they matched me with other kids around the world, and we hand wrote letters to each other, and they're my lifelong friends. These were friends I made when I was 13, 14. They helped me get my English better and better. And I learned, so I was practicing my foreign languages that way. We were sending trinkets to each other. We got to learn about beautiful places and photographs and postcards and other things. And that was a very analog way of being, learning about these things and not waiting until college. And I got accepted into a prestigious program to actually do international study abroad and cultural exchange and all of that. And I say this because we probably have teachers who don't have the resources and others who have a lot of resources. And I'm aware of this inequity that happens around the world. And what I would say is we are in an exciting era right now where you can take the spectrum of availability of tools, from analog, which is the pen pals that I had when I was a teenager, all the way to like really fancy blockchain education, AI tools. So one, I guess to leave you with one, and I think Jennifer, you'll make this available on the resources, is the Smithsonian Science for Education, Center for Education in Washington, D.C. has created a set of free curricula and courses that basically teach, they use SEL skills and other competencies to teach kids, how to understand sustainable development goals, how to solve for them, how to be better global citizens. These are all tools that you can literally, if you're a teacher or a professor, take and use in your programming. And I think, and there's so much more out there just like that. So it's an exciting time to be in that part of the equation where you're really influencing young minds as early as possible.
The Smithsonian program that you mentioned is a brilliant example, I think, of that, the kind of triangulation between the application of social and emotional learning, the understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals, and then thinking about the real world value of what you learn in high school. So if I remember it rightly, there's a kind of, looking at how does what you're learning in science curriculum help you understand and look for local solutions to the kinds of challenges that the SDGs are designed to mitigate against. And then the SEL component comes in building alliances and communicating what you're trying to do. And that's something which, is in many ways an analog approach, isn't it? Because it's an approach or a way of thinking about the application of the curriculum that is accessible and available to everybody. I think that's another really good point, Anna, that you've opened up, is if we believe that, social and emotional learning skills are really important for the future of international relations, they are also skills that can be put into practice and tested and strengthened and developed on a daily basis. You don't need to wait until you have an international engagement in order to develop them and use them. And a lot of education reform is, I suppose, looking at that. Mark, could we bring you in for some final comments?
Very brief, because I know we're short of time, but there are good examples of countries that have woven global learning and global citizenship into their curricula, and then amazing examples of teachers who take that broad framework and go way beyond the kind of minimum expected and apply their imagination and professionalism, share resources, draw on other people's resources to enable the young people in their schools, their students, to have a truly global perspective and learn social and emotional skills at the same time as understanding the global issues, and prepare young people for life in this both wonderful world, but also somewhat threatening world. There are lots of challenges ahead. Those SDGs are the code for both the answers, but also are the shorthand for the challenges we face. So I think there's some examples, I think, in the resources that you'll share afterwards. We're just looking at the Scottish curriculum for excellence, got some really good practice there. Other parts of the UK have as well. But I know that I'm speaking from a UK perspective. I know there are many other examples around the world. So those resources are there. But ultimately, we all want the world to be a safer and maybe more prosperous place for our children and grandchildren. We want the world to be here with supporting life in the way we would hope. And addressing climate change. These are global issues, shared issues. Diplomats and governments will play a role, there is no doubt, but every single one of us will play a role, and education about those global challenges is at the heart of the solution. So I think the power of the people, every individual, through applying their social and emotional learning skills to the challenges ahead, will actually, ultimately make the world a better place. And if that fails, governments and diplomats, I'm afraid, won't save us. It's all up to us.
Brilliant from both of you. Thank you so much for giving of your time and sharing your expertise and insight and being with us today. And thank you to everyone who's been watching this online. Jennifer, would you like to
Thanks,
close
Dominic,
us out?
Mark, and Anna, and a brilliant conversation. And I know for the educators that are online, you made some great comments and questions, and the interactions were fabulous. So I know that this has been beneficial to all of us. And Mark and Anna talked about resources that are available for teachers and schools and districts and ministries of education that are interested in looking at this combination of SEL and international relations. They've listed some things here. What we will do on our on-demand version is, which should be up on the site either tomorrow or the next day, We will have links to all of these resources that Mark and Anna have put together. And again, you know, as educators, we're trying to make this happen in classrooms so that our K-12 kids will have an opportunity to hear. We also have lots of people online that are from the post-secondary venue as well. So these resources will be available in that on-demand version on our site. Just a couple of things to end off with. One of the things that we have new to Signature Leadership Series is our actual podcast, and you'll see some great interviews there with some amazing academics in both the education sphere and the mental health and well-being spheres. So we're now available on Apple and Google and Spotify, so feel free to jump in. Of course, all those resources are free. And finally, looking forward, our next one, we're going to take a month off next month. For those of you in the Northern Hemisphere, lots of us close down for part of the month of August and take a bit of a break. So we will be back with the SEL Global Leadership Series on September the 15th. And it will be a feature on SEL and Indigenous teachings. And certainly being a Canadian, I know that many of you from around the world will hear the challenges that we have here in Canada and trying to think of truth and reconciliation by, first of all, acknowledging the truth of our country and really looking at reconciliation and trying to learn from the many amazing Indigenous people and how we can have that impact learning for all of our students. So that is going to take place in September, and it will not be strictly Canadian. Our host will be Joanne McKecken, who is from New Zealand, and she'll have some Maori leaders, and we'll have a cross panel there. So that's on September the 15th, and we hope that you can join us there.